Good morning. It is 7 minutes past 6 o'clock. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio, and I'm Gene Purcell, here today filling in for Joy Cardin. The votes cast in last week's presidential election in Afghanistan haven't been tallied up totally yet, but when they are, the problems facing Afghanistan will remain. And here in the U.S., there seems to be increasing debate about the presence of U.S. troops there. It's coming up on 8 years since the war in Afghanistan began, and whether there is an end in sight is subject to debate. Here's a quote from President Obama speaking last week at a VFW convention, and here he is explaining the importance of the efforts in Afghanistan to the defense of the United States.
If left unchecked, the Taliban insurgency will mean an even larger safe haven from which al-Qaeda would plot to kill more Americans. So this is not only a war worth fighting. This is fundamental to the defense of our people.
We're going to be talking about Afghanistan this hour, and our guest says the focus there needs to be on economic rebuilding and good governance. And he worries that impatience from the international community, including the U.S., could get in the way of that. Mark Sedra is our guest this hour, a senior fellow and the head of the program on global and human security at the Center for International Governance Innovation based in Ontario. And we'd like to know what you're thinking about Afghanistan. Should that U.S. involvement increase? Should it decrease? And why are we there? Our toll-free number is 800-642-1234. You can also use email to get in touch with us. That address is talk@wpr.org. Mark Sedra, good morning. Welcome to Wisconsin Public Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's good to have you along. Well, first things first, the news in the last, couple of days, couple of weeks has focused on elections, lots and lots of violence, bombings again yesterday. Where should the focus on the news be? Obviously, these are the day-to-day occurrences there, but we don't see a lot of focus on other things in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, I think that the elections, there was positives and negatives. The positive, I think, is that despite the low voter turnout, and the turnout was somewhere in the line on the line of 40 to 50%, which is significantly lower than the 70% of the voting public who came out to the polls during the first presidential election. That's somewhat disappointing, but you have to consider that Afghanistan just emerged from 3 decades of warfare. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Holding an election of this size in and of itself is an important achievement. And I think if you consider the deteriorating security situation and the fact that the Taliban carried out a campaign of violence and intimidation to keep people away from the polls, I think the millions that did show up to the polls is a testament to the development of Afghanistan's nascent democracy. So I think that there are some positives to point to. The violence, of course, is disturbing. We see that the fact is that it's deteriorating. We know now, as of yesterday, it's been the deadliest year for foreign military forces since 2001 when the Taliban were unseated. So I think that this is disturbing, and I think you have to focus on that in the news coverage. But I think it's also important to look at what's happening in terms of economic development, what's happening in terms of developing the Afghan administration, where there has been both achievements made as well as setbacks. I mean, I can tell you that when I go to Afghanistan a couple times every year for the last 6 years, and I could tell you that the level of economic development that I just see anecdotally is quite remarkable. So Afghanistan is making significant achievements. We're talking double-digit economic growth every year. We're talking about the level of infrastructure that's being developed is quite remarkable. So although we are seeing a deterioration in security conditions, we are seeing corruption increase over the years. We're also seeing, many important positive developments.
So some significant achievements. When you're looking at these elections, there have been all sorts of charges of voter fraud, that sort of thing. How important is it going to be that the elections are perceived as not being tainted in some way, and what exactly is riding on these elections?
Well, I think it's the legitimacy of the democratic process is riding on these elections. So I think it's very important. There were hundreds of allegations of fraud. I think it's somewhere in the line of 800, 50 of which have been deemed serious, and these are reports of fraud and complaints that were made to the Electoral Complaints Commission of Afghanistan. So I think that the important thing is that these are fully investigated by the Electoral Complaints Commission, that action is taken where warranted if evidence of fraud is uncovered. And I can say that some of the reports that I've seen are certainly quite disturbing, and probably this is the most electoral irregularities that we've seen in the 3 elections that have taken place in Afghanistan since 2001. So I think in order to give confidence to the Afghan voters that this is that the polls are not rigged, that they are genuine, that very public and swift action has to be taken.
And Afghanistan, not exactly the first country in history to have charges of voter fraud. How is the Election Commission doing? How is it being perceived in the country? Does it seem as though people are looking at them as a source of accurate information, that they're trying to do the right thing?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that those who are more sophisticated in terms of their understanding of the political system in Afghanistan are certainly watching to see what the commission is doing. You have to remember that Afghanistan still is very high illiteracy rates across the country. The majority of the Afghan population are illiterate, many of which don't have access to some basic sources of media and so on. So I think that people will be looking for sort of general signs that the government, and particularly also the international community, are going to be ensuring that this election is somewhat free and fair. So I think that there will be those who are watching, and I think that it's important that the right public statements and the right sort of action is taken.
And let's talk a little bit about the leading candidates. Hamid Karzai, of course, Abdullah. And as I understand it, the last results I saw were from yesterday, and the election way too close to call. 10% of the totals were in, and there was a very, very close margin there. But what are the implications if Hamid Karzai remains in office? What are the implications if he doesn't?
Yeah. Well, I think if Hamid Karzai remains in office, that you'll see with a new mandate, I think you will see him take a tougher line on some keystone issues. Things like corruption, where I think that that is perhaps, in my view, one of the issues for many Afghans, is one of the sort of the defining characteristics of his administration, that you saw very high levels of corruption, cronyism, and criminality in the Afghan administration, so which prevented them from delivering basic services to the population, which is how people judge the administration. I mean, for Afghan business elites, it meant that it was tougher to do business, tougher to set up businesses, and for the average Afghans, it meant that in their day-to-day life, whether it was dealing with local administrators to get their kids into schools, which are reopening across the country, and somewhat they had to pay bribes, and dealing with local police. So I think that there will be an emphasis on the Karzai administration on cracking down on corruption and improving the effectiveness of the public administration. I think also people will be expecting President Karzai to take a tougher line with the international community, particularly regarding the actions of international military forces. There's a lot of frustration in the Afghan public over collateral damage, so to speak, over the large number of Afghans who have been killed in actual coalition and NATO military operations. And so I think that there will be an emphasis in him also cracking down on that, or at least publicly taking a tougher line. And finally, I think the vast majority of Afghans haven't seen a peace dividend. What do I mean by that? They haven't really seen the benefits of the post-Taliban political order. They haven't seen really development money flow into their communities. In some places, this is due to insecurity. And, in other cases, it's due to the incompetence of public administration or really the failure of the international community to invest in certain parts of the country. So I think they're going to be expecting more. I should mention one other thing, which, of course, perhaps is the key thing, and you almost take for granted because it's so central, is, of course, the security situation. And that there has to be, I think, that one of the big focuses will be to develop the Afghan security forces so that they can take control of the security situation, which is running out of control in certain parts of the country.
All right, we've got to take a break right now. When we return, we will continue our discussion about the future of Afghanistan, and we'll be looking for your calls, too. 800-642-1234. I'm Gene Purcell in for Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. It's 19 minutes past 6 o'clock. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Gene Purcell. I'm filling in today and this week for Joy Cardin. This hour we are talking about Afghanistan, even as presidential elections are being tallied up there in Afghanistan. The future of the country, very much. Lots and lots of questions about that. We're talking about the future of Afghanistan, the future of the international and U.S. role there this hour. Mark Sedra is our guest, a senior fellow and the head of the program of Global and Human Security at the Center for International Governance Innovation, based in Ontario. We'd like to know what you're thinking about Afghanistan as well. Should the U.S. involvement there increase? Should it decrease? Tell us what you think. 800-642-1234. And you can also email us, talk@wpr.org. Well, let's go to the phones right now, and we have a call from Steve. Steve joins us from Madison. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Mr. Purcell. I'm really wondering, why does the United States military-industrial complex really want to carry on this low-intensity warfare, always to have something simmering? First Iraq, now Afghanistan. What is really in the basic interest of the U.S. war machine? Is it just to carry on the whole 9/11 hoax, the idea that the guy in the cave in Afghanistan was the guy that did 9/11? Everyone knows that's preposterous. Those skyscrapers were pulverized by explosives in 10 seconds.
All right, that's okay. Steve, we got the question. We don't need to talk about the skyscrapers right now. But I think Steve does raise the question, Mark Sedra. A question a lot of people are asking all of a sudden is why is the U.S. there anyway? Why is anybody there anyway?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's a very good question, and it's a question I think that all of the countries engaged in Afghanistan have to be constantly asking themselves is what are we doing there? What are we achieving in Afghanistan? I mean, I wouldn't agree with the notion that for instance, that it was a hoax, that in terms of the Taliban or particularly Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan wasn't responsible for planning the attacks. We saw certainly that Afghanistan was a sanctuary for all sorts of non-state military actors and terrorist groups from around the world. I mean, we saw a whole generation of international jihadi militants who were trained and cut their teeth in Afghanistan. We saw that the Al-Qaeda had an entire almost bureaucracy in Afghanistan. They had offices in the Taliban Ministry of Defense. So certainly we saw that many of the attacks across the world, that from Bali to various attacks in the Middle East to of course September 11th, were planned in Afghanistan. So I think that preventing Afghanistan from once again serving as a sanctuary and as a training ground for international terrorists is important for the international community as a whole. But it's also important in terms of regional security. South Asia and Central Asia are critical areas, strategic areas for the United States and the international community. This is an area where an emerging source of energy globally in terms of Central Asia with natural gas and oil. You also have a nuclear armed power in Pakistan that has hardly been shown to be stable. So you don't want it having unstable neighbors that could feed into the destabilization that we see in Pakistan. So I think that there are a number of reasons to be there, which quite apart from the humanitarian reasons. I mean, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. There is, you could say, a moral responsibility to be in Afghanistan. They fought one of the decisive battles of the Cold War on behalf of the United States and the international community, with the support of the United States and the international community. And for the most part, the international community walked away from Afghanistan after that war against the Soviet Union was won, and we saw what happened afterwards. The country descended into civil war and chaos. So I think that there are many compelling reasons to remain in Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean it's not important to monitor progress, to see if this is still a war and an intervention worth supporting. I think thus far it is.
You know, one of the things that occurs to me is some of the reading I've done about this, 8 years, I guess, seems like a long time to an awful lot of people, and it isn't a long time to an awful lot of people. But as you point out, the issues in Afghanistan are a lot deeper and a lot longer than 8 years. I mean, we're talking decades here that have led up to this particular moment.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we have to really adjust our time frame when we're looking at the Afghan situation. We're talking about a country that's emerging from 3 decades of warfare. And you cannot rebuild a country such as that in just 7 or 8 years. I mean, the reality is it takes time, and that goes for any state-building or nation-building exercise anywhere in the world. This is building up institutions takes time, and it takes patient support. I think, as I said, there are compelling strategic, moral, and humanitarian reasons to remain in Afghanistan, and I think that it's important that the international community and the United States look at the big picture here and say that Let's be honest, we have to stay here for perhaps a couple decades. Now, let me qualify that statement. I'm not saying, for instance, U.S. troops or 100,000 foreign troops, as are currently stationed in Afghanistan, have to be there for a decade or more. Over time, as the situation stabilizes, that mission shifts to more of a civilian mission. It's more of the emphasis will be on development assistance, on assistance to train government personnel, on promoting good governance in the Afghan administration and in society. But for the time being, in the short term, there is a need for that security assistance in the form of international troops. So I think that over time, the nature of the mission will shift.
Let's go to the phones right now, and Joan is with us from Shorewood. Good morning, Joan.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. My view is that there is no military solution in Afghanistan. What we need is a diplomatic solution. Afghanistan is in shambles with poverty and lack of jobs, and education is the solution. Most members of the Taliban were orphan boys at the time of the warring factions, and we have been trained by the mullahs in militarism, anti-American views, and that's all they know. We need a solution in terms of education. An example of that is Greg Mortensen, an American who wrote the book 3 Cups of Tea, and he told his story about how he went to Afghanistan and with very few resources built small schools one at a time, and he brought opposing groups together. So I think the solution is going to be jobs, education, diplomacy, and not just increasing the violence. The military solution simply increases and prolongs the violence.
Joan, thanks for the call. Let's give our guest a moment to answer that. Mark Sedra, diplomatic, talking about schools, education here. Anything to disagree with there?
No, it's a fantastic point. You absolutely. I mean, the vast majority of Afghan young men are unemployed. Many of them actually carry out operations for the Taliban, or many of them are vulnerable to Taliban recruitment because they're unemployed, because they need money and resources to support their families. So absolutely there's a need to stimulate the economy. However, unless you have a baseline of security, unless you have some stability, it's hard to stimulate investment in Afghanistan. It's hard to resurrect the economy. So I think that you have to look at both things simultaneously. You have to look at economic development, and you have to look at improving the security situation together, because they reinforce each other. In terms of a diplomatic solution, I also entirely agree. I think that it's necessary, to be quite honest, to reach out to moderate elements of the Taliban movement, to talk to them, to try and bring some of them into the fold. This is absolutely critical. I think that that's a mistake that wasn't made early on. There was an assumption that the Taliban could be defeated easily militarily early after their regime fell. And this obviously has turned out to be mistaken. One of the primary parts of Karzai's electoral platform is his approach to actually negotiating with the Taliban. And I think it's important that is taken seriously by either of the candidates, whoever turns out to win this election.
We've got to take a break right now. When we return, we will continue our discussion with Mark Sedra this hour. He is a senior fellow and the head of the program of Global and Human Security at the Center for International Governance Innovation based in Ontario. And we are talking this hour about the future of Afghanistan. Of course, the U.S. has a lot of investment in that future, and we'd like to know what you think about it. 800-642-1234. After we break for the news, we'll come back, take some more of your calls. You can also join in by email if you have a question or a comment. talk@wpr.org. I'm Gene Purcell. I'm in for Joy Cardin this week. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. Good morning. It's 25 minutes before 7 o'clock. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Gene Purcell. I'm here today and this week filling in for Joy Cardin. This hour we are talking about Afghanistan, even as the votes are being totaled up in the presidential election. We're taking a look ahead to the future of Afghanistan and talking about the future of what's going to happen there. Also, the future of American involvement, the involvement of the international community in Afghanistan as well. Our guest this hour, helping us sort through all of this, is Mark Sedra, a senior fellow and the head of the program of Global and Human Security at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and that is based in Ontario. We'd like to find out what you think. Is Afghanistan something that you've been thinking about a lot and wondering about the U.S. involvement, wondering what is going to happen to that country and why it matters to us? 800-642-1234 is the number that you can use if you'd like to join in. You can also email us. That address is talk@wpr.org. Let's go to Duluth, Minnesota right now, and Carl joins us. Good morning, Carl.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Yeah, the U.S. simply needs to get out of Afghanistan and get out now. The U.S. does not have any sort of humanitarian goals in this military occupation. I mean, there's still villagers dying weekly from drone attacks and bombings. And, this election was simply an attempt to garner some legitimacy for an illegitimate, corrupt regime, and even it failed with massive corruption and low voter turnout. We're supporting brutal warlords with with poor human rights records, and it's only for U.S. interests, corporate interests, that we're in there in the first place. So, the majority of Americans don't support the war in Afghanistan. The majority of Afghanis don't support the war. And what was interesting to me is that clip you played from Obama, which sounded exactly like something that would have come out of George W. Bush's mouth. So it doesn't matter whether Democrats or Republicans are in office. We can't rely on them to end the war in Afghanistan. We have to do that. People have to do that by protesting in the streets. So there needs to be a movement against this war, and it needs to end now.
All right, Carl. Thanks for the comments. Mark Sedra, I think Carl's comments echo what more and more people seem to be saying here, that the U.S. should get out, and lots of questions about what our purpose there is.
Absolutely, and I can understand the impatience that many people have with the slow progress, or in some cases lack thereof, that's been seen in Afghanistan. And I think a good point has been made about the large number of Afghans who have been killed in coalition military attacks. Now, the number who have been killed directly by the Taliban is far more. Maybe you can multiply that by a factor of 3. I mean, we just saw within the last couple days, 41 people killed in Kandahar by the Taliban in multiple car bombs, most of which are civilians, women and children. So I think that one of the renewed focuses international military forces in Afghanistan has to be on protecting the Afghan population. That is is a central lesson of insurgencies that we've seen over the last century, that those which have been successful focus on winning the hearts and minds of the local population by protecting them. And I think that has to be one of the focuses that we see going forward. Now, I would take issue with the notion that the majority of Afghans want the international community out. I can tell you that that's not the case. Every poll that's been done in Afghanistan has showed that still a majority of Afghans want the international community to stay. They even international military forces. Now, that support is somewhat dwindling as each year goes on and people see a lack of change. However, still a majority of Afghans support the international engagement. I mean, that wasn't the case in Iraq, for instance, where always there was very little support for the international, and particularly the U.S. presence. But in Afghanistan, it's always been somewhat robust, and I think that consent for the engagement, the international mission in Afghanistan is absolutely critical, and it has to be, the international community has to work to preserve that and to strengthen it.
You know, outside of Afghanistan, we've talked earlier in the hour about, I don't know how to phrase it exactly, kind of a sense of impatience. You know, we would like to solve these problems. We would like to sort of move on. Within Afghanistan, and I'm not sure whether you alluded to that or not, is there that same sense of impatience, or are the people there taking more of a long view? They realize it's going to be a long slog.
Well, I think one of the problems in Afghanistan was that expectations, perhaps this is the problem also in the international community in the United States and so on, is that expectations were raised so high. I mean, immediately after the fall of the Taliban regime, the Afghans heard both their own leaders and also leaders from around the world, including George Bush, who spoke about huge aid packages, Marshall plans, and so on to rebuild Afghanistan, to bring a new future for the Afghan people. So I think many Afghans felt they'd see that change happen almost immediately. I think in that sense you've seen some dashed hopes. But I think for the most part, Afghans are quite, even though they may be, a large proportion of the Afghan population may be illiterate, they've become quite sophisticated politically, and they see that this is, a long process. But the bottom line is they need to start seeing some change. They need to start seeing some development start to trickle in. They need to start seeing an improved public administration. Otherwise, they will continue to sit on the fence or even move towards the Taliban and other opposition groups. 800-642-1234 is our toll-free number if you'd like to join in. We've got some open lines for you. Email us, talk@wpr.org. Mark Sedra is our guest this hour, Senior Fellow and the head of the Program of Global and Human Security at the Center for International Governance Innovation based in Ontario. And we're talking about what's ahead for Afghanistan. Now, Mark Sedra, one of the things that Carl from Duluth brought up, we had played a clip from President Obama early on in the hour, and he said, that you could have just transposed those words right into George W. Bush's mouth. And I'm wondering about that change in administration, whether you've seen a change, whether those words coming out of President Obama's mouth really are the same, or if there is a difference between the two. Well, I think there's a pretty significant difference in that, in fact, the Bush administration really didn't take Afghanistan all that seriously in the initial days after the war. One of the main reasons NATO forces weren't expanded across the country is because the United States under President Bush opposed NATO expansion. We could have seen many of the problems we're seeing today in the south and east of the country. I'm not saying that they would have been handled earlier on, but perhaps we would have seen the roots of the insurgency attacked before they really developed into the full-blown campaign that we see today if international forces had been expanded across the country in 2002, 2003, and 2004, rather than just in 2006 and 2007. Now, U.S. troops, the main reason that the Bush administration opposed it is that there were U.S. coalition troops fighting in the East and the South, and they were focusing purely on counter-terrorist and counter anti-Taliban operations, not on securing the territory. In other words, peace building, providing stability in order for Afghans to go on with their daily lives. So I think that we've seen with President Obama. He has said clearly Afghanistan is the priority. For the Bush administration, they didn't want to see a distraction from the war on terror. They didn't want to see a distraction from the war in Iraq. Whereas President Obama has said clearly Afghanistan is the priority. And I think that that's a pretty substantial difference between the two.
And certainly here in the U.S., when you're talking about attention being paid to things, for a long time, U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, it seemed as though not exactly forgotten, but certainly it was, I'm not even sure if it was perceived as a minor player, but it just seemed as though, it was sort of over there somewhere on the side, and our real focus was somewhere else.
No, absolutely. I mean, the historical record is clear on the fact that not enough resources were dedicated to Afghanistan to, in other words, mopping up Taliban and Al-Qaeda after the actual Taliban regime fell. We saw that Al-Qaeda were able to escape into Pakistan, as well as much of the Taliban leadership, and we know that that's still the base for both the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda leadership is in the tribal areas of Pakistan, just across the border from Afghanistan. Had those mountain passes and so on been sealed with more resources from the United States and other members of the international community, perhaps you would not see some of the problems that we see today.
Talking about the future of Afghanistan this hour and inviting your phone calls at 800-642-1234. I'm Gene Purcell, and I'm here today filling in for Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. It's 12 minutes before 7 o'clock. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. Coming up after 7 o'clock, as lawmakers ponder amendments to the proposed health care reform bill, healthcare cooperatives are getting some attention. After 7 o'clock, we'll be talking about healthcare cooperatives as a viable alternative to a public option for healthcare. That's coming up after 7. This hour, we continue our discussion on the future in Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan, with our guest, Mark Sedra, Senior Fellow and the head of the Program of Global and Human Security at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and that is based in Ontario. Let's go to the phones right now. Tracy joins us, and Tracy is in Oconto. Good morning, Tracy.
Good morning. I have more of a comment on the last caller. The men and women who had served prior to myself and my husband are the ones that gave him that right, to go out and protest. But something those protesters have to realize is they're not there. They haven't been there. Just like in Iraq, I'm absolutely positive that there have been some very good things happening in Afghanistan, but they're not going to put that on the news because that doesn't sell. And, to me, it seems like in Afghanistan that, if the focus isn't there anymore, they need to refocus on the Taliban.
Tracy, thanks for the comments. Mark Sedra, let's take the second one first. The focus there, Tracy says, should be on the Taliban, and you have spoken to that a bit.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely we have to focus on the violence that the Taliban is perpetrating against the local Afghan population. The human rights abuses that the Taliban has undertaken. It was a brutal regime. We're talking about a regime that if as a man your beard was not long enough, you would be beaten in the streets, perhaps thrown in jail. We're talking about a regime that when it was in power, if a woman was not fully covered, they would be thrown in jail or beaten in the streets as well. we're talking about a regime that had a religious police who would roam the streets with almost impunity to carry out whatever punishment they saw fit. So, I mean, I think that, there's no question that most Afghans do not want to return to the Taliban regime. The vast majority of Afghans simply do not want to see the return of this type of extremism and brutality. However, they also have to see from this new administration and this new regime that change is actually coming. And I think that that's very important.
One of the points Tracy brought up, I think she said something along the lines of, I know there's something good happening in Afghanistan, but we're not really hearing about it. Is that the case? Are there good things happening in Afghanistan that we're not hearing about?
Oh, well, absolutely. And I mean, 6 million children have returned to school, half of which are girls. Over 4 million refugees have returned to the country, essentially voting with their feet, saying that they feel it's stable enough to return. You see double-digit economic growth every year. You see the flowering of the business community. Afghanistan now has its first billion-dollar company, a telecommunications provider. Seeing Kabul develop in terms of its infrastructure over the last 8 years myself and other parts of the country has been quite remarkable. So, I mean, there has been, and I could go on and on. But so there has been some tremendous progress that has been made. I mean, we've seen 3 elections being held in this country, one of the most liberal constitutions in the Islamic world being passed. So I think that, there is a lot of positive things to point to, but there's also been, of course, as we've mentioned and as is covered in the news, I mean, we can't ignore the fact that also the security situation has deteriorated quite significantly over the past few years. But I think that obviously it would be nice to see some more balance in the news coverage.
Yeah, and it does bring up that point of news coverage, though, because you can have a lot of good things happening, and then, yesterday, one bombing, and bang, you're right back in the headlines.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's one of the great challenges that you face in terms of trying to get the message out concerning what's actually happening in Afghanistan, because as we all know, the cliche, if it bleeds it leads, and it's natural to focus media attention on these types of brazen attacks, but in reality there is a lot happening under the surface that probably isn't covered, which would show the American population and other NATO contributing countries that there is the blood and treasure, so to speak, that's being invested in Afghanistan is actually also achieving some dividends.
Let's go to Carl right now, and Carl's with us from Peshtigo. Good morning.
Good morning, Gene. How is the people of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Muslim community addressing the Taliban, which is part of their culture? It's their world, and we'll take. Isn't the Taliban like to bring back the old rules of the Muslim world, such as how they want to tyrannize the females or the women?
Mark Sedra, what about the role of the Taliban? We've talked about it a bit, but if you take a look at it from a regional perspective. How is support for the Taliban these days? And in terms of winding up in Afghanistan, as you pointed out earlier in the hour, if the elections don't go well, people are going to turn somewhere.
Well, I mean, the Taliban vision of Islam is a very narrow, particularistic. I think many Muslims would say quite a twisted vision of Islam. Certainly wanting to take it back to some vision of past glory, or so to speak. And I don't think that is shared by the majority of the Muslim community worldwide, or I know it is not shared. And so it's not a reflection of all Muslims in the region or all Muslims in the Middle East. I think that there are those, however, in the Gulf, those in other parts of South Asia, and even globally, some fringe groups which express support for the Taliban movement. We are certainly seeing that one of the largest sources of income or monetary support for the Taliban comes from private donations from benefactors, primarily in the Gulf states. And so that is something that is, of course, worrying. This type of supply of funds is going to have to be choked off, of course, if you're also over the long term going to at least marginalize the more militant elements of the Taliban movement.
We're approaching the top of the hour, and I sort of want to end where we began, talking a little bit about the election. Now, the election, as I mentioned earlier in the hour, the results I've seen are far, far, far from complete. But they've been very close. And, it could wind up to be a very close election. And if that happens in Afghanistan, how does that work out? I mean, let's say there is a clear winner, but it's close. And that winner doesn't particularly have, a mandate, if you want to use that word. But what if it's close enough where the results aren't clear? Then what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's one clear result that of course, neither candidate wins 50% of the vote, according to the Afghan Constitution, there has to be a runoff between the top two candidates. And as you've said already, Gene, that neither candidate has 50%. Now, we're in early days still. Less than 10% of the votes have been counted, but we see that Karzai has roughly 41% of the vote, and Dr. Abdullah has 39%. So if we don't see either candidate get that 50%, hit that threshold, 50% plus one, then we're going to have to see a runoff. And these runoffs are complicated. They're expensive. They also are vulnerable, again, to security incidents. And I think there is a lot of people in the international community who don't want to see a runoff, of course, for both logistical and security reasons. However, it is my belief that if neither candidate gets 50%, it shows the health of Afghan democracy. We saw that opposition candidates ran very smooth, sophisticated campaigns. They've been, despite voter fraud, we're seeing a quite tightly fought electoral battle, and I think that only can demonstrate to the Afghan population that this election is not rigged, that there's not someone behind the curtain pulling the strings. That in fact, this is a genuine race and a fair contest for who can manage the country for the next presidential term. So I think that there are positive elements in terms of demonstrating the legitimacy of the democratic process for most Afghans. However, there is going to be, there will be some political instability as well. And I mean, that's also been stoked by the accusations of fraud.
And that election, the results being watched as closely from outside of Afghanistan, I suspect, as internally.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's key to have a strong partner. I mean, in the end, the Afghans have to determine their own destiny. We are only, and I say we in terms of the international community, is only supporting their transition to peace and stability. And so a strong, trustworthy partner is needed in the president's office, one with a solid mandate and the legitimacy and support of the population. And I think that only a fair process that's seen by the majority of the Afghan people can produce that. So I think that this election is very an important benchmark or indicator of where Afghanistan is going.
Well, Mark Sedra, thanks for joining us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Mark Sedra has been with us for the past hour, a senior fellow and the head of the program on global and human security at the Center for International Governance Innovation based in Ontario. And we've been talking about the future of Afghanistan, the elections there underway, and where they go, well, time will tell. If you'd like a copy of the program, you can listen online in our online archives at WPR.org. This hour was produced by Rob Ferret. Brittany DeAnda provided us with on-air production, and Cynthia Schuster helped out, too. I'm Gene Purcell, and I'm in for Joy Cardin this week. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.